This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 396, Anxiety, Part 2. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you trembling all over?
Yes, but what else is new? I mean, it's Tuesday, Wednesday.
Wednesday.
What happens every Wednesday, yeah.
It's Prince Spaghetti Day.
No, Wednesday is Sunday at Carvel.
Oh, perfect. Well, this is part 2 of an episode that we promised you at the top of this month. I think it was episode 392, where we talked about anxiety. And we found ourselves so deep in the subject and only halfway through the canon that we would have to cut it short and give you a part 2. So hopefully you haven't been worrying yourself as you've been waiting for this. and lo and behold, we have extra time this episode because unbeknownst to me, episode 395 was not the final episode of July. I can't calendar. So we did the giveaway last episode. So we have ourselves free this entire episode to talk about anxiety.
Oh, that's wonderful. You know, isn't it funny how as we age, we discover we're missing fundamental skills like that, like calendaring and telling the time and big hand. You know, every so often you find a pretty well-established adult walking around in an airport and asks somebody what time it is, and they tell him, and you always hear the adult say, "Wait a minute, tell me that again about the big hand and the little hand? What? Is that what those numbers mean?"
I seem to be losing more skills as I age. It's not the way it's supposed to go.
I read a new book yesterday, and I lost long division completely.
Hey, I would kill for that. Well, we are not here to talk about reading, I guess it's related to reading, but we're going to talk to you. So all you have to do is sit back and listen, or get on your knees and garden and listen, or get on your treadmill and walk and listen. But this is anxiety. Before we jump into this topic, just wanted to remind you that, of course, the show notes are available in the app you're listening to us on or at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. You can, at wherever you happen to be, click on those links that get you to Patreon or Substack, which allows you to support the show and to get bonus content from time to time. We do appreciate your support, which comes in as little as $1 a month. So check us out at patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com and subscribe to us wherever you get podcasts. Okay, well, we promised you anxiety, and anxiety we shall give you. Bert, the last time we were here, we stopped at the Hound of the Baskervilles. We covered the 3 novels up through then and the adventures and the memoirs. So we have The Return of Sherlock Holmes, His Last Bow, The Valley of Fear, and the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes to cover this time. Where would you like to begin?
I would like to begin in the Norwood Builder because we've got a view of Holmes that we seldom have. We find in the Norwood Builder Watson making this note to the reader. He says, "It was late when my friend returned, and I could see by a glance that his haggard and anxious face, that the high hopes with which he had started had not been fulfilled. And so for an hour he drones away on his violin, endeavoring to soothe his own ruffled spirits." And that may be unique. It certainly is very seldom that we see Sherlock Holmes that low.
And what was getting him down at this? What was worrying him?
Well, he hasn't made any progress in his investigation. He says, "It's all going wrong, Watson. All as wrong as it can go. I kept a bold face before Lestrade, but now I believe that for once the fellow is on the right track and we are on the wrong. All my instincts are one way and all the facts are the other." And that's just amazing. Really is amazing development.
It is. And thank goodness Jonas Oldacre overplayed his hand, literally by putting a thumbprint on the wall. Of course, Holmes comes back, spots the thumbprint, and realizes, aha, this wasn't here before. And suddenly he lit up with enthusiasm and figured out exactly what was going on. So, and in my mind, in the Granada series, this episode and these scenes were played so well by Jeremy Brett, who looks so despondent in the first part, and then just filled with excitement and energy as soon as he figured it out. It's really an amazing transformation to watch.
Yeah, a brilliant characterization by a great actor.
Indeed. Well, let's move on to the dancing men. Of course,
yes.
Hilton Cubitt was a little worried about these stick figures that had appeared, drawn in chalk and left in a note on the grounds of Ridingthorpe Manor or Riddlingthorpe Manor, depending on which volume you're reading. But again, Holmes was the one who was taken with anxiety. He looked at the copy of the note that was left on the sundial, bent over this grotesque frieze for some minutes, and then suddenly sprang to his feet with an exclamation of surprise and dismay. His face was haggard with anxiety, and he said, "We have let this affair go far enough. Is there a train to North Walsham tonight?" And of course, they missed the train. They couldn't go there until the next morning, and by then it was too late. So his anxiety was well informed.
Yeah, it was. And I wonder why. I guess it was too late to get a telegram up there. You know, if he's so concerned, you would think it's not likely that there would be telephone lines at this point in the canon, I don't think. Yeah.
And this note that was written out in stick figures that Holmes translated or transcribed was, "Elsie, prepare to meet thy God." So that would have created anxiety in me had that been my client that was receiving that note.
Yeah, well, Holmes didn't translate it very well. I think what he really read was, "Elsie, prepare to feed thy goat." But that's why he said, "We've let this affair go far enough." Yeah. Oh, now I don't hear you.
Well, that's because I muted myself.
God.
It works.
It works well. Okay, let's go to Riverside. Da, 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 da.
Okay, after Dancing Men, where do we find ourselves? I think the one that really stuck out to me was, well, actually, let's keep this in order here. The Priory School. Priory School. We have Thornycroft Huxtable, who shows up on the doorstep of 221B, presents his card, and then collapses on the bearskin rug in front of the fireplace there, clearly worn down. He was overly anxious and certainly haggard from his trip. He hadn't slept in a while, hadn't shaven in a couple of days. And he mentioned that the Duke of Holderness himself was anxious, particularly anxious to avoid public scandal. Right? So a lot of anxiety happening in and around the events with the Priory School.
Yeah, and, the fact is that His Grace himself, the Duke of Holderness, is very anxious to avoid all public scandal.
Yes.
And, so it is a very anxious situation. It's odd, though, that in that amazing introduction of the story that his anxiety isn't particularly called out. But then I think his behavior more than communicates that to the reader.
No doubt.
Yeah. Well, and then we have, what do we have next? Well, the issue here, we should tell listeners, the word anxious or anxiety pops up, relatively frequently in the cases of Sherlock Holmes. But what we're trying to do is pull out the real defining moments of anxiety where, in particular, there are unusual things like Holmes appearing himself to be anxious and haggard. But in Six Napoleons, of course, Lestrade is, anxious.
And of course, I suppose we could add to the anxiety, the nervousness, the tension in that story, Mr. Horace Harker, who stumbled across a dead body on his doorstep and then was so flustered he couldn't get off his story to the press. When this is his profession, right? He's so worked up by what he's found that he has trouble putting the story together.
Yeah, that's true. But I think it's in the next story, in The Missing Three-Quarter.
Yes.
That we really have a good notion of anxiety. And boy, that becomes pretty obvious clearly in the introduction of the story. It's a gloomy morning and a telegram arrives. Await me, terrible misfortune. And then Strand postmark dispatched at 10:36. And then in comes Cyril Overton, an enormous young man, 16 stone of solid bone and muscle, who spans the doorway with his broad shoulders and looked from one of us to the other with a face which was haggard, this, big, mighty athlete, haggard with anxiety.
Yeah, that was indicative. This juxtaposition of the manly man and yet this almost anxious breakdown that he's having. And of course the telegram that Holmes and Watson later found, or the remnants of a telegram that were at the telegraph office. The last words in it were, "For God's sake." And Holmes said, "I'm anxious at getting no answer." So, yeah. And then after The Missing Three-Quarter, we find ourselves back in Baker Street, another one of these tense opening scenes. The two visitors who arrived in this case were Lord Bellinger and the Right Honorable Trelawney Hope, Secretary for European Affairs, two cabinet members. Right? They sat side by side on our paper-littered settee, and it was easy to see from their worn and anxious faces that it was business of the most pressing importance which had brought them. The business, of course, was a missing letter from Trelawney Hope's dispatch box. We later find that it was, unknowingly taken. I was going to say innocently. It was unknowingly taken by his wife in order to hush up a blackmailer. But she herself, Mrs. Trelawney Hope, was concerned. She said, I desire, even against his will, to share my husband's anxieties. That's how worried he was. This is a time I think we need to remember, and particularly English Victorian society, when men kept their affairs of business and certainly the affairs of state separate from the women in their lives. This is typical drawing room where after dinner the men were left alone to discuss their quote-unquote manly affairs and the women discussed theirs. So for Mrs. Trelawney Hope to say that she wants to share her husband's anxieties, this is kind of crossing over that brain-blood barrier, as it were, in order to really help put him at ease.
Yeah. Well, and, as we get into this, it's another case where Holmes's face grew tense with anxiety. Because when we're in the actual scene of the crime, let's say Lestrade is pointing out the carpet. It's not just fastened down, only laid here. We raised it, we found, and then Holmes says, "Yes, you found." This bum, bum, bum moment. Holmes's face grew tense with anxiety. And then, you're not getting the payoff right away. There's a little more conversation. Slowly comes the reveal. Well, you'll be surprised to hear that there's no stain on the white woodwork to correspond. No stain? But there must. And that's Holmes, of all people. And there you go. And Lestrade chuckles with delight at having puzzled the famous expert.
That was a good one. Okay, well, let's see. After the second stain, I think we find ourselves in the Bruce Partington plans. This is interesting because, one on the heels of the other. Of course, there's another government document that's gone missing. Cadogan West has shown up dead outside of on the tracks of the underground, and no one knows what to make of it. And the plans for the Bruce Partington submarine were gone, vanished, stolen. And Mycroft was involved. Of course, he was the government, but he conveyed to Sherlock just how serious this was in his telegram, as he named off the three major spies in the ring around London. He said, "Glad to hear you've seen some light. The cabinet awaits your final report with the utmost anxiety. Urgent representations have arrived from the very highest quarter. The whole force of the state is at your back if you should need it." Now that's pretty serious when an entire cabinet is racked with the utmost anxiety.
It's interesting, too, isn't it? The dichotomy between that anxiety and worry from the statesman and Holmes's reaction. He just says, smiling, "All the Queen's horses and all the Queen's men cannot avail in this matter." And then he looks at a map. Well, things are turning a little in our direction at last. He slaps Watson on the shoulder with a sudden burst of hilarity. And then he says, "Do stay here, and the odds are you'll see me again in an hour or so. If time hangs heavy, get foolscap and a pen and begin your narrative of how we saved the state."
Ah, that's great. That confidence, that ebullience, that's what we expect of Holmes. Of course, at this point, we don't know why, but the map holds the secret.
Yeah. That's a lot of fun.
I like that.
Yeah. Well, and then we have the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, and there's plenty of anxiety about the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, but as the story progresses, someone has come to find her, and that's the Honorable Philip Green. And he is just beside himself in worry about the whereabouts and safety of Lady Frances Carfax. 3 times had he called for news. The third time, within an hour of this fresh development, his clothes were getting looser on his great body. He seemed to be wilting away in his anxiety. If you will only give me something to do, was his constant wail.
Yeah, and again, we see this juxtaposition of manly man and someone who is just overwhelmed with stress and anxiety in his worry.
It's interesting, too, that in a few paragraphs, to add to this, for some reason, Watson then gives us a little backstory about Philip Green. He says, for 2 days, the Honorable Philip Green, and then this odd parenthetical expression from Watson. He was, I may mention, the son of the famous admiral of that name who commanded the Sea of Azov fleet in the Crimean War. Brought us no news. The Honorable Philip Green, who's the son of the admiral, brought us no news. And then, look what happens. On the evening of the 3rd, he rushes into our sitting room, pale, trembling, with every muscle of his powerful frame quivering with excitement.
We have him, he cried. He was incoherent in his agitation. Holmes soothed him with a few words and thrust him into an armchair. And again, that's an interesting juxtaposition. Soothing and then thrusting. Here, calm down. I'll shove you into a chair.
Soothe and thrust.
Well, speaking of juxtaposition, we always know Watson as stalwart and as, mostly unflappable. And in the Mazarin Stone, and this is interesting because the Mazarin Stone is narrated by a third party, not narrated by Watson, the way we are typically used to these stories. So this is a third-person omniscient. They write, Watson's honest face. And don't you just love that? Watson's honest face. Good old Watson. Watson's honest face was twitching with anxiety. He knew only too well the immense risks taken by Holmes and was well aware that what he said was more likely to be an understatement than an exaggeration. Watson was always the man of action, and he rose to the occasion. Count me in, Holmes. But twitching with how does a face twitch when you're anxious, I wonder?
Yeah, it's true. And, Holmes reflects that. Holmes gets a sense of what's going on with Watson because Watson says, count me in, Holmes. I've nothing to do for a day or two. And Holmes says, your morals don't improve, Watson. You have added fibbing to your other vices. You bear every sign of the busy medical man with calls on him every hour. Yeah, but isn't that interesting? But how much more effective it is to hear Watson talk to us in these cases rather than have a mysterious third party describing him.
Yeah. Much better. Okay, well, I think we're going to round the bend here with one final anxious person.
Bum, bum, bum.
Do you have any clue who it is?
Well, I hope her anxiety will soon be set to rest.
Yes, it will be.
Good. So tell us who she is.
Mrs. Ferguson.
Oh, Mrs.
Of the Sussex
Ferguson.
Vampire, wife of Big Bob Ferguson. We never learn her first name, by the way. But, of course, she was almost out of her mind over the well-being of her infant, who, of course, was the victim of the half-brother. I should have said spoiler alert, but seriously, if you haven't read The Sussex Vampire at this point, you really shouldn't be listening to us. So she was worried, being locked in her room, not having access to the baby. She was relying on Mrs. Mason, the housekeeper, to oversee things. And Holmes came and basically set her fears at rest as he figured out what it was and wanted to help her in the hardest part of this, which is breaking the news to her husband. And that's the thing. Mrs. Ferguson here not only was racked with concern over the safety of her baby, but also racked with guilt over revealing to her husband that his firstborn was as twisted as he was.
Yeah, that's true. Really is true. Amazing. Really, it's a lovely set of circumstances there, and a real sort of wander through the emotions that are afoot with people in these kinds of relationships.
Yes, and worry no more, because we don't have a third part to this series. And that's just a trifle.
A trifle, yes.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Calm yourself, Dr. Huxtable.